So hey everybody, we are going to catch up right here on topic 4.4, which is about America on the world stage. Specifically, we're going to take a look at the War of 1812 and kind of an uptick of nationalism after the conclusion of that war. So we saw this slide briefly in class a little while back, but I want to make sure to use this as a refresher to help us hit context for this. The goal for the United States in the early years of the Republic is going to be to create an independent global presence. The idea that the United States should be treated as an equal among the European powers. To do that, there was a real focus on the promotion of foreign trade. A little bit of economic independence was always considered to be a good thing for the new country. And then kind of establishing a foothold in North America with the claim of territory. To that end, with a little bit more detail coming up in this, through this presentation, through this lecture, is going to be, issues with the War of 1812, and then about a decade later, the causes leading to the declaration of the Monroe Doctrine. And then in class on a different day, we will talk about how the American Indian Removal, the Indian Removal Act in 1830, is going to have an impact on the U.S. establishing that role. But let's take this one step at a time and start with the War of 1812. So there are really like two big categories of causes that go into the War of 1812. First off is there's a perceived challenge to American neutrality. I think you know as well as anybody that Washington's neutrality proclamation of the 1790s was something that Americans tried to adhere to for decades and generations, and especially here in these next several years. By the beginning of the 19th century, by 1799, the French Revolution is turned into the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte takes over as the leader of France, and in essence, not only declares war against the rest of Europe, but is able to make very good progress in that war against the rest of Europe, which is leading to a a conflict between the British and the French in regards to American goods coming in and out of the country. This is going to lead to the presence of the French Navy under Napoleon is going to lead to British interference in U.S. foreign trade, which is also going to lead to the policy of impressment of U.S. sailors. Impressment is a British policy saying that anybody born in any British territory is in fact eligible to be drafted into the British Navy on a moment's notice. That meant they could take you off of one ship and put you into the British Navy immediately. And this is true for anybody born in any British territory. And the way they read it at the time was that included the United States, because the United States was formerly a British territory, and depending on who you talk to in England, they still consider it to be a British territory. So as this begins to happen, it starts to kind of create some tension among New England merchants. This leads Thomas Jefferson to encourage Congress to pass the Embargo Act of 1807, which is going to cut off trade between the U.S. and European powers almost altogether. So with the cartoon here, and this is like one of these U.S. history famous kind of cartoons, you can see there's a British ship here in the background, and you can see that there is a little bit of illegal trade going on. So there's some smuggling that's going on here, and so this guy is carrying this battle that says super fine on it. This is sugar that's in here, and so he says, "Oh, this cursed, oh grab me," talking about this turtle that's kind of grabbed a hold of him and keeping him from getting down here to do his trade. And this guy says, "Darn it, how he nicks him," talking about the turtle here. So this seems a little bit weird, and "oh grab me" is not really a word, but you may have noticed that the word "oh grab me" here is actually the word embargo spelled backwards. So this is a political cartoon kind of showing the level of disdain that a lot of Americans had towards the Embargo Act, but it seemed to be effective, that it was going to hold the United States at bay from getting pulled into this European conflict. The second major cause to the war has to do with what's happening out on the frontier. There are still a handful of British military forts out in the old Northwest Territory, and those British military bases are now offering military support to American Indians in regions that the U.S. is wanting to increase settlement to. And so this tension for the British is going to lead to the likes of Henry Clay and John Calhoun, a couple of big heavy hitter congressmen. Henry Clay from Kentucky, we will keep talking about him for weeks and weeks. Same with John Calhoun, we'll be talking about him for quite some time. Both these guys are going to hang out in Congress for about 40 years, so big impact coming from them. But they're among the loudest congressmen that are calling for a declaration of war. And they are actually going to be, as a Southern and as a Western representative, they're going to be people that are going to convince the rest of Congress to declare war against Britain in the spring of 1812. And this is a fairly significant turning point. So far as the war itself is concerned, this is a weird war. There's really not a whole lot of detail that we need to know about it. We'll definitely hit like a couple of those as we go through this, but there's not any kind of like real clear solid victories that the United States has during the course of the war itself. By 1814, Napoleon is deposed from power and the British sends reinforcement to fight the United States, which is why in the summer of 1814 they invade the Capitol and they burn the White House, and it's devastating for like the morale of the country so far as all that goes in 1814. There's the Battle of Fort McHenry, which is where Francis Scott Key writes the lyrics to the Star Spangled Banner talking about the flag. This literal flag in this picture is the flag that the national anthem is written about. And so to me, the most significant thing that comes out of the war is it is the national anthem. Everything else that happens during the course of this is a little bit on the, I guess, less important side of things. Not everybody in the country agreed that the war was a good idea. The Federalists up in the Northeast, specifically New England merchants that were Federalists. If you think about this, this would make sense that New England businessmen are going to be Federalists because they want to see a growing national economy because that's going to give them more people to sell their goods to. Even though they were having some of their sailors taken off of ships and impressed into service, they didn't care. They want to maintain foreign trade with the British and avoid a war because that's the biggest trading partner for the United States, which is definitely a big deal up in New England. So this leads to the Hartford Convention in December of 1814. We've talked about this a little bit separately. They, proposed constitutional amendments to kind of help the United States avoid any future war that could turn out so badly as the War of 1812 with the ransack of Washington, D.C. and everything else. Some of the delegates at the Hartford Convention even suggested they secede from the Union. And so this is like definitely not some nationalism coming through here through the course of the war. But like we talked about in class, by the time they present the findings of the convention, by the time they take it to Washington, news about the Battle of New Orleans has already come to pass. And this is where Andrew Jackson first becomes a notable name in the United States, where he is going to not only defeat the British, but resoundingly defeat the British at the Battle of New Orleans. The photo here, this is Jackson Square in New Orleans, right, close to the French Quarter, just behind where if we were standing taking this picture, the Mississippi River is literally just about 50 yards behind us. That statue of Andrew Jackson is a sign that he is still regarded as a hero in that part of the country because, well, he's going to save the United States from like British rule. This battle is the most decisive battle of the war, but the real quirky part about this is that this battle takes place about 2 weeks after the peace treaty had been signed. So on Christmas Eve, 1814, in Ghent, Belgium, the United States and the British, they sign off on an agreement called the Treaty of Ghent, which in essence, adheres to the rule of status quo ante bellum, which literally is Latin, translates into the same as it was before the war. No territory changed hands. No, I mean, they kind of agree that they're just going to go back and properly enforce the Treaty of Paris back in 1783. And so when you look at the War of 1812 in and of itself, I don't know how to describe it, and give my take on it other than say it's a very weird war. It is fought over something that didn't seem important by the end of the war because there is no real reason to keep fighting by the time they get to 1814. The most significant battle of the war is fought after the war was technically over. The most important thing that comes out of the war is a flag and a song. So it is something that, just kind of cooked into that. It doesn't feel like a normal war. It feels like more something that's going to be helping to define what the United States is going to be after the fact. And that after the fact is really an upsurge of nationalist feelings in the United States. The U.S. feels there's like a sense of pride that we kicked some British butt at the Battle of New Orleans. There's a sense of pride that the Star Spangled Banner was yet waving, over the United States. For decades, this war is referred to as the Second War of the American Revolution. So this is a really strong sense of pride. In the aftermath of this, those American ideals of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, it translates into other parts of North America with the Latin American revolutions as Mexico and countries further to the south gain independence from Spain. But as this happens, the concern by the early 1820s is that other European powers could see this as an opportunity to move in and to expand their colonial holdings. So as a way to combat this, President James Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, they drafted this document called the Monroe Doctrine, which in essence is going to just really validate the idea that this is an American continent and that the United States was going to be the major force in this continent. So the British need to stay out, and the rest of Europe needs to stay out. And as a turnaround on this, the U.S. agrees that we'll just stay out of European affairs. But I don't know if there was any kind of real threat of that because that really hadn't been happening anywhere up until this point. So you get to a spot where this is one of the things that we were talking about in class, looking at some documents. Is this a continuity or a change in U.S. foreign policy? The one thing I can tell you is that this is going to, in the long run, help develop an American strength and an American identity around isolationism. For the next century plus, the United States is going to consider itself to be separate and unique from Europe in many, many ways. And I think the Monroe Doctrine is a major part of it. So what you see with the idea of America on the world stage is this desire to kind of take what they thought was the rightful place alongside the European powers, but try to do it kind of separately and distinctly from those European powers and try to grow kind of a form of exceptionalism for the United States. Thanks for listening.